passion. I will always be around. Will it ever get sunny? Oh, I wonder, honey. I'm tired of being in the line. You say it will. I'm caught in your addictive brain. You say it will, yeah. I'm crossing the obsessive line. You say it will. I'm caught in your addictive brain. You say it will, yeah. I'm crossing the obsessive line.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4 of Trucksafe Live, the show where we and our guests tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon Wiseman. I'm the president of Trucksafe Consulting and a partner with Childress Law, both of which are dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Before I go any further today, of course, I want to say Happy Veterans Day to all of the men and women out there who have served or who are serving the country. We really appreciate your service and appreciate your sacrifice. So thanks so much from all of us. We've got another great show lined up today. I'm really excited to talk about today's topic. You know, as I said at the start, this is the show where we try and tackle hot button issues. And the first few shows that we had, we talked about nuclear verdicts, and then we moved on to talk about data and telematics and how carriers are kind of being inundated with all of this new data that's coming at them and how to manage that. And then last month we talked about independent contractor issues and of course the ongoing court cases that we have out there dealing with that particular issue and impacting motor carriers that have owner-operator fleets. So today's topic, the show's title is In It for the Long Haul, and we're going to be taking a close look at driver qualification, onboarding, orientation, and how those different processes are influenced by federal and state regulations and how they can be leveraged to develop and retain drivers. And obviously, in fact, the biggest issue we now know after the ATRI report just came out in the industry, at least for motor carriers at the moment, is the so-called driver shortage. It's something we've heard a lot about, we've talked a lot about for many years. It's something that has seemed to have plagued the industry for those years, and it's something we can just never really get a handle on. There's no question that we're facing a significant problem in terms of securing and even retaining qualified drivers to haul freight. So, and in fact, we're seeing this play out in real time. If you just turn on the news, you're hearing about the supply chain and disruptions and the very real impact that's having on our daily lives. So, like I said, the ATRI report, if you haven't read that yet, we talked a little bit about it last week when we did a show live from the MCE conference. But ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute, each year releases its annual report of the top industry issues. And this year, number one on the list was of issues impacting motor carriers was the driver shortage, followed shortly by driver retention in the number 2 spot. And so another thing that we heard come out probably a week or two ago was the ATA's chief economist, Bob Costello, who reported that in his estimation, we are currently about 80,000 commercial drivers shorter than where we need to be. So obviously a big problem for motor carriers. Now, I have to acknowledge that some and maybe many in the industry dispute that there's a driver shortage. They'll say that it's more of an issue of driver retention and carriers not really doing enough to retain the drivers that they already have. And so for what it's worth, I suspect that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I think we do have, I think we are short on qualified drivers. And I also think that can be exacerbated by carriers not investing enough in their existing drivers. So obviously the question here is, what's the fix to this? What can we do to get more drivers in their seats, and what can we do to keep them engaged and keep them and make this a place for them where they want to stay and where they feel like they're being compensated enough? So, just in my view, I think we have kind of I think we need to take kind of a multifaceted solution, one that probably requires some legislative initiatives, and then also one that requires some buy-in from motor carriers to kind of turn things around here. On the legislative side of things, of course, we just recently saw the U.S. Congress pass the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, and you probably noted, if you read up on that, one part of the infrastructure bill is kind of opening the doors to allowing more drivers to enter the market and be able to operate commercial motor vehicles. So one of the issues that's causing this, I think, has to do with the fact that right now the way the regulations are structured, in order to be a qualified driver, you got to be 21 years old at least to operate in interstate commerce, and obviously that cuts out a big population of potential drivers. It keeps motor carriers from being able to recruit straight out of high school, and that's caused a big issue. So one of the things that the infrastructure bill does is it directs the U.S. DOT to set up an apprenticeship program, which will open the door to 18 to 21-year-olds to be able to operate commercial motor vehicles as long as they have an experienced driver with them in the vehicle. So we'll see where that goes. It's going to be a pilot program starting out, and hopefully that will help. Obviously one of the concerns with having younger drivers drive over the years, it's just not it's the 21-year-old age limit is not just something that just came out of nowhere. The U.S. DOT and Congress set that as the age based on studies that they were looking at that said drivers at a certain age are a lot more likely to be involved in accidents. And so based on that data, they set it at 21. So I think with the apprenticeship program opening the door up, we'll be able to gather some more data, and hopefully we'll be able to keep something like that around. So in any event, these are the questions we're going to be tackling today. We're lucky to have with us two individuals who are passionate about helping carriers properly qualify drivers and onboard them in a way that sets them up for hopefully successful and long careers in the industry. So let's bring them on here. First up, we have Hayden Cardiff, who is the founder and chief innovation officer for Idelic. Hayden, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Brandon. Appreciate the time.
Sure. And then also we have Brian Runnels, VP of Safety for Reliance Partners. Brian, thanks for being here.
Hey, Brandon. Glad to be here.
Hey, before we get into the weeds here, I want to give you both a second here to introduce yourselves, to give us your background, and tell us a little bit about your company. So, Hayden, you want to start us off?
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much for the invite. I'm really looking forward to diving in here. So again, my name is Hayden Cardiff, founder and chief innovation officer at Idelic. Very quick background here is at Idelic, our main focus is to make sure drivers get home safe each and every night. And that's of the motor carriers that we work with, but also you and I and our families that share the roads with those professional drivers each and every day. And so we do that by really focusing on that entire holistic driver experience and helping the management team to better engage those drivers at the right time in the right ways. So we are helping to consolidate all of the data across all the different platforms that you as a motor carrier use. It's your ELDs, your cameras, the FMCSA portal, accidents, claims, injuries, work comp, customer complaints, HR, all of the information that helps to understand what the driver's behaviors are, helping to consolidate and pull all that in, and then giving you proactive and predictive insights, being able to help you understand before major events happen who's most at risk, being able to help you understand where anomalies and different insights are coming from your data, and then most importantly, giving you tools and ways to be able to enable workflows to help act on that information and that data, and then help people hold people accountable to acting on that data. And so that this topic is obviously one that's near and dear to our hearts because it's something that we help our motor carriers with every single day, and really help to support our drivers, who are the ones that that most of our focus and attention needs to be on.
Well, thanks again, Hayden. Brian?
Hey, I'm Brian Runnels. I'm the VP of Safety with Reliance Partners. I have a long background in transportation. I started as a driver in 1992, came off the road at the end of 2011, and went into safety. I was a driver trainer the last 8 years that I drove. So in keeping involved with the driver training department, and then had the ability to start my own school with an in-house school with a carrier here in Indiana. Which was a great experience, learning how to, all the facets of adult learning and putting those to good use. After some time doing that, it was insurance gave me a call, which was fantastic. Came into the loss control side of insurance. Got to spend some time at a large insurance company, an underwriter, so I got a good feeling on how they operate. And then finally at Reliance Partners, we're a commercial retail insurance agent, and we just started this safety program. So I take a lot of what Hayden has, all that data, and how do we address that with the drivers? How do we make sure that we keep our drivers safe, but we also make sure that they understand that this kind of stuff can't go on, and we've got to tame it down, but do it in a way that you don't lose them after that first conversation.
Yeah.
So that's where the trick is to make sure that you have a culture within that company to allow yourself to use that data, act on the data, but make sure that you don't just cancel somebody out because of the conversation you're having about that data.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. We're in an industry where turnover for drivers is near 100%, probably more than 100% for a lot of carriers, and it's there's got to be a reason why that is, and there's got to be a solution to getting that down. So I think. I'm glad to have you both on. I think you both got a lot of investment in this very issue, and I'm interested to hear from you. So obviously the show today is all about driver qualification, onboarding, and orientation, terms that are sometimes used interchangeably. You'll hear those terms used interchangeably throughout the industry, but they really describe different processes, I think. And so, first question, I guess, is how do you both look at those different processes and their purposes? Hayden, you want to start us out?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Those three things are very distinct processes, and they need to be looked at as distinct, right? When you start to look at driver qualification, right, that's that minimum standard, especially from a compliance standpoint. Is this driver fit to drive at our fleet? Can we bring them in? And that's more of that kind of pre-hire process. Obviously, you're filling out and doing a lot of that into orientation and onboarding, but again, a lot of that comes beforehand. And then you start to look at the orientation process. And this is one of the things, like from a structure standpoint, most of the fleets that we talk to is 2 to 5 days is generally kind of what people run through their orientation. They're bringing them in, they're getting them excited, they're talking about their culture, they're getting all of the things in a very quick kind of boot camp way, getting their drivers up to date on what they need to do to be effective. But man, like, no one can be effective at their job having a 3-day crash course and then shipping you off and giving you no other training and no other engagement after that. And that's where onboarding and kind of the real integration of that driver comes in. And this is something, Brandon, we're going to talk about for the next little bit here, but it can't be, orientation and that 3-day kind of process can't be your driver onboarding. Like, it has to be a 6-month, 12-month process obviously the timing and the engagement along those 12 months are going to be vastly different. So a lot of it's going to be front loaded, but like, that consistency and that touch point has to go on for a much longer time period for it to be effective and for the driver to feel like they're coming into a fleet that they want to be at and they understand what the expectations are and they can be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been my experience, at least working with the fleets that I've worked with, is you hear the term orientation thrown around, and it's usually just considered a 2 to 3 day thing, and they're out the door, and now they're drivers. They're treated the same just as any driver that's been in the fleet for a long time. So I think it does make sense. It's imperative that we kind of split these up and take the time to think, okay, we need to spend some more time when we're first onboarding here to get these drivers engaged in our platform. Brian, you have any thoughts on kind of the distinctions between orientation and qualification and onboarding, those terms?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the qualification, that is the nuts and bolts. And, when you're putting those nuts and bolts together, now with the technology the way that it is, if you can get some of those things out of the way before a driver even shows up, you're ahead of the game. That makes your orientation time more valuable. You can use it for more distinct things, whether it's company specific, whether it's policies and procedures, whether it's, that's your first impression with a driver. Let's not forget that, the driver's making a first impression on you, but you're also making a first impression on them. And when they come in, we all know that a good orientation has these certain items to them, whether it's what they're going to talk about in training or things like that. Excuse me. But what's the building look like? Do you offer them coffee? I mean, is it, oh, we're going to bring pizza in for lunch, but yeah, you just have water? Is it something like that? Because that's the first impression that to leave them with. And then the onboarding, Hayden's absolutely right. That is not here's the keys, we'll see you later type thing. Because let's remember, in that crash course, a driver's probably going to remember 20-30% of what he heard. And some of the important things that are going home, health insurance, payroll, items like that, maybe they don't remember, or they were so worried about, getting on the ELD and the ways to work with that, man, there wasn't enough room up here for all that information. So the follow-up is probably one of the most important things you can do in an onboarding process, to make sure that those guys aren't frustrated coming out of orientation. And let's not forget the truck. Let's make sure the trucks are clean. They're ready to roll. I've had a situation, driver gets in a truck and the darn thing breaks down before he's even out of the yard. And that, the chances of keeping that driver are very, very slim.
Yeah. Talk about a bad first impression.
Exactly.
I think we're all kind of in agreement here that you can at least cabin off driver qualification from onboarding and orientation. At least in my view, I always consider driver qualification to be what the regulations require and really nothing more than that. It's what the federal or state safety regulations say you have to do at a bare minimum to make sure that a driver is physically qualified and is a safe driver enough to be able to put them in a commercial motor vehicle. So maybe we'll start with the driver qualification process, and I'll ask you all, and maybe this will start with Brian on this one. What all is involved? I know it's a lot, and we don't have to get into the detail, but what all is involved in qualifying a driver under the regulations? If we're talking about the federal regulations, for example,
it's all those things that complete out a DQ file. Those are the things that are required, whether it's the application that's filled in full, no time gaps, all dates and everything have to be accounted for the last 7 years. And then you have to verify 3, and then you got to make those efforts to get those 3. You got drug and alcohol items. You got to make sure that you get the results back on that before you send a driver out. And you've got the drug and alcohol clearinghouse piece. You've got, I'm drawing a blank.
Well, so I think to your point, Brian, you've got a number of big buckets of things you got to get done at the qualification stage. You mentioned the previous employer request that you got to reach out to their previous employers and check on their driving history. You've kind of got the drug and alcohol. MVRs, checking on their driving record and seeing, hey, what types of violations do they have in the past? And then you mentioned drug and alcohol testing, obviously a big one for CDL drivers and the clearinghouse. So it's just all of these boxes that you got to check before you can even consider putting that driver in the vehicle. Hayden, it's been my experience that there's kind of been a sea change in the way that carriers qualify drivers and the way that they are kind of automating that process and outsourcing it to different third parties over just even the last 5 to 10 years. So is that your experience, and what do you see as kind of the industry standard nowadays?
Absolutely. And Brian touched on this before as well. And that's the goal here, is to get drivers in-house and in a truck as fast as possible. From first touch to hire to behind the wheel, can we compress that time frame as much as possible? So you're trying to now go in and see what can we do in parallel? What things do we need to have right at the beginning? And so you're trying to process this out and get a much smoother kind of timeline across all those different DQ file items that Brian just talked about. So you're trying to think, all right, from a background check, from a drug screening, from an on-road test, like what needs to happen when? And how can I start to make sure that I can consistently get that as early as possible? Now, to your point, Brandon, like the key to the game is now, how do we automate this, right? Because there is definitely a shortage of qualified drivers. You talked about at the beginning, and I think that's the key stipulation here: qualified and safe and good drivers. There's plenty of drivers out there, but do you want them behind your wheel? That's a different question. But then the same goes for a lot of back office personnel as well. Like, you can't just keep throwing bodies at this type of problem. And so people are starting to automate. People are starting to outsource, right? You have a lot of solutions providers and vendors that do a lot of this work for you, and they are fantastic partners if you find the right ones. And we've seen a huge migration from from the fleets that we work with, going to some of these providers, whether it's a full stack, take care of the entire recruiting process, whether it's people who do the drug and alcohol or the background checks or the screenings or the pre-employments, whatever the case is, you have people who do specialties. And so I would highly recommend that you look at inward, take stock of kind of what you have on your team, and think to yourself, what do you do well? What do you not do well? And then, like, don't try to force fit things that you don't do well, because you're going to waste people's time. You're going to waste your time, your teammates and employees' time, and you're going to get frustrated because you're not going to get the results that you want in the way that you want it, right? Like, that's why these people exist. So, like, definitely explore that option, because we've seen, to your point, the standard now is bringing on and having a strong team internally, and focusing, like, if you're really good at the recruitment process, getting drivers in, selling your story, why you're different, what the driver's going to benefit, great. Focus on that recruitment process. But if your team stops there and you don't have a ton of experience with whether it's the DQ file management and kind of getting a lot of the background checks, getting a lot of the screenings, like there's just a process and kind of paperwork that needs to get done, outsource that. Like, there are things that you can do to just make your life easier, and it's worth the incremental payment, because you're gonna see it in value on the back end and speed to get drivers in the door.
Yeah, I think a lot of carriers are hesitant because of the cost. I mean, historically, the DQ process has been paper-based. I mean, it was only probably 6 or 7 years ago, I would be auditing, and it would only be auditing motor carriers' compliance, and it would be only the large motor carriers that would even consider automating the DQ process and using outsourcing these to third parties and keeping their files electronically. Only, I would say, in the last 5 or 6 years have I started to see that become more accessible for the smaller carriers. And I think that's important for them to know, is that it is accessible nowadays for even the smallest of motor carriers to do this. And And you're right, Hayden. It cleans up your files so much to do it this way, and reduces a lot of your headache. So, just examples from my own practice over the years: auditing the carriers that are still paper-based DEQ files, or not even paper-based, but just kind of managing it on their own. They just run into so many problems where either they're keeping way too many records that they don't need to keep in the files when they could purge those and get rid of them and not have to deal with them, or they're not keeping good enough track of the expiration dates on driver's licenses and med cards, and they just don't have a system to notify them. And so what that ends up doing is just leading to all of these violations in the files, and then that comes back to bite you in a DOT audit real hard. So by outsourcing this, at least in my opinion, the carriers that outsource this to a good third-party service provider, and there are a lot of them out there nowadays, it's just such a burden off of you as the motor carrier. You can focus on getting the drivers in the door. You can focus on operating the trucks, and you don't have to worry so much about the paperwork. Brian, you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, it really comes down to something so simple as it is, as much as you can automate compliance, then you can focus on safety, because they're two different things. And safety you can't automate. That is an interaction between the office personnel, the safety director, and the drivers. That can't be automated. But a lot of this stuff sure can be.
Yeah. Kind of along these same lines, what components of the qualification process do you find that tends to trip carriers up the most? Is it the previous employer request, the drug and alcohol testing? What about the process, the qualification process, causes the most heartburn?
So
I think it's just.
Oh, go ahead,
I
Brian.
think it's just knowing what that good faith effort means. Getting the information back on previous employment. Either they do it too much. I've seen them, they keep banging and keep banging and keep banging on a previous employer. It's like, okay, you can stop now. You've made the good faith effort, or they just don't do it. They make one attempt, it's in the file. You're like, no, you got to do a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
Have seen a couple carriers get in trouble with a delayed drug and alcohol response. And, in the efforts to getting that driver on the road and getting him going, we'll get that tomorrow. It'll be fine.
Well, that's always
caught on it.
That's always been my concern. It's like, okay, put aside the regulations for now. The regulations say you do your good faith attempts and you can wash your hands of it. My concern has always been from a highway accident litigation. You do one attempt to get the information from the previous employer. You say, I'm done. But then it turns out the driver actually did test positive in the past, and then he gets involved in another accident involving drug or alcohol use. Now that's going to come out to the jury in your case that you did one shot at trying to get information from the previous employer. Had you done a little bit more digging, you would have found out that there was a drug and alcohol problem, and you didn't do it. And so I don't want my clients to be in that position of having to defend that process. So I think you're right, Brian. I think you got to make at least 2 attempts to do that. And I always recommend that, even though the regs say you don't have to get those done before you put the driver in the truck, they can get done within the first 30 days. I always recommend that you go ahead and get them done before you put the driver in the truck, just in case a situation like that arises. I think the other interesting thing about the previous employer checks, now that we're on that situation, is the fact that hopefully that will eventually be sunsetting as we kind of roll out the drug and alcohol clearinghouse into its full form, right? So that's the idea, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but eventually once the clearinghouse is in full swing, I think in the next 2 or 3 years, that will be the place where motor carriers go to check whether the driver has drug and alcohol violations. And so there won't be necessarily a need to do the manual process of reaching out to previous employers and trying to get a response and never getting a response. Obviously that process is problematic, so hopefully that'll get taken care of. Hayden, any other thoughts on problem areas for qualification?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that we see is just consistency, right? Like, it's not necessarily one thing over the other. It's the fact that you do most of the right things most of the time. And it's in those examples that you don't do it, whether it's a process breakdown, a people breakdown, whatever the case is, when you don't do that, that's what gets put on trial. And it doesn't even have to be a driver that you made an error on that got into a crash. The plaintiff's attorneys now, and I know you talked about this in a previous episode, the plaintiff's attorneys now are putting fleets themselves on trial. And so they look at all of your records, and if they see any inconsistencies, they're going to point those facts out. Not to the point of that's what caused this crash. No, to them, that's irrelevant. It's the fact that you as a motor carrier are not consistently managing your requirements and standards to put drivers on the road and behind the wheel in the first place, or your hiring practices, your training practices, whatever the case is. They're poking holes to say you are not doing the right things. You're a menace to the communities that you're driving in and the communities that the jury is sitting in, and therefore you need to be punished or you're not going to learn a lesson, right? And so all reason gets thrown out the window, and now you get millions of dollars of verdicts thrown your way just because these inconsistencies for drivers that ultimately didn't get into the crash now come to light. And so those are the things that when we talk to fleets, like we're trying to really focus and emphasize, we have to do the basic blocking and tackling and making sure that everything is documented and logged and tracked to make sure that you're getting all that squared away so those types of scenarios don't come.
Yeah, it's that reptile theory of litigation that we've talked about over and over again. It's leading to those nuclear verdicts that we see, and you're right. It's what can we do to be able to defend our safety program? And that kind of leads me into another related question. You know, when a lot of one thing that a lot of carriers I think miss is that the safety regulations and the driver qualification requirements, by their own admission in the regulations themselves, it talks about these being minimum standards for driver qualification. These are the floor requirements that carriers are supposed to meet before they put a driver on the road. But that doesn't mean that carriers can't go above and beyond those requirements and require something in addition, if they feel it's warranted. And so my concern is that carriers that are just following the regulations with the mindset that these are the regulations, these are what I got to follow to get the driver in a seat, they're exposing themselves to those types of arguments and those types of reptile theory litigation where a plaintiff's attorney will come in and say, hey, look around you, carrier. All of these other carriers are doing X, Y, and Z when they're bringing on board drivers. They're checking to make sure they don't have any moving violations in the past 2 years. They're checking to make sure they don't have any DUIs in their personal vehicles. None of that's required by the regulations, but these carriers are doing it as a matter of best practice. And why aren't you doing that? And so I think that's something important to keep in mind. And I'm curious to hear from both of you. What have you seen carriers impose more stringent requirements, and in what areas are they imposing more stringent requirements than what the regulations might require?
Well, I think too that jumped to mind beyond the ones you said is, let's face it, a road test isn't required by the regulations. You know, they've got an active CDL that can be used as a substitute. But I think, road testing and having a documented route that you're road testing so it's consistent, like Hayden was talking about, and you can show that to an inspector or somebody like that, say, look, this is the one we take everybody on. This is what it covers. It has railroad crossings, it has this, it has that. And, it's concise. The other one that jumps to mind is a PSP. And I think you're seeing more carriers put weight on that for their violation history. And it still amazes me to this day that there's a lot of companies out there and the business owners and drivers alike that don't understand that, citations and violations aren't the same thing.
Yeah.
And, I only got a warning for speeding, but I got a clean inspection. I doubt it, because I bet there's a violation written on that inspection for the 6 to 10 over that you were going. Yeah. So, it's things like that. So they're finding some alternative ways to look at things. Maybe we don't see it too much in the trucking industry yet, but I know in some other industries, there's also, people are subject to what their social media looks like. So yeah. I don't know if carriers are doing that, but that might be an avenue that they go down if somebody is in question.
Right.
Yeah, no. To answer your question, yes, fleets are absolutely having to, not just wanting to, but having to change and improve those standards. Because let's face it, a lot of this is coming from the plaintiffs bar, and that they themselves have raised the bar on what the minimum standard of care actually is, what constitutes negligence, whether it's hiring, whether it's retention, whatever the case is. And so where I've seen the most movement in those standards actually is on the post hire side, right? The onboarding, the actual driver safety training, and the engagement side of things. I mean, I've talked to fleet safety, VPs of safety and VPs of operations who jump into depositions for hours just getting grilled. Why are you using predictive analytics? No, I am not. Why? I don't know. Right? Like, and for an hour asking those types of questions, like, are you using the cutting edge technology? Are you being able to look at proactively and predictively what your drivers are doing? Are you training based off that information? Can you today say with 100% certainty that you are certain that your managers are completing those trainings or those coaching events? Like, that level of visibility is out there. And if you don't now kind of step up and meet that standard, you're going to face questions on why not. And plaintiffs' attorneys are going to try to make the case that what you're not doing is the industry standard because it's available.
Yeah. And I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you set your bar too high and you walk yourself into a position where, especially in the middle of a driver shortage, you're desperate to get drivers in the seat because you're losing money. And so you look at your standards and you say on a case-by-case basis, well, let's just make an exception for this one driver. He's pretty good, but he doesn't meet this particular standard that we've set. I'm more concerned about that situation than if they never had the standard to begin with. I would almost always advise clients, keep your standards at a place where you can realistically enforce them every time. I would rather you do that than to set them higher and to be making exceptions from them on a case-by-case basis. So
Brandon, that brings up a really good point, which is, to me, it might sound like semantics, but you talk about standards, but you also talk about documented requirements, right? Yeah. And so from a hiring perspective, for example, you have your company policy written down in your hiring practice, in your driver handbook, all of those things as far as what constitutes the ability to be hired as a driver for your fleet, right? Yeah. And to your point, that is exactly right. Those standards need to be realistic. They need to be at or slightly above kind of requirements from a DOT perspective. But you should have your personal standard as something that's higher, that you're trying to reach on a consistent basis.
Aspirational.
Exactly. And so no matter what, you're always above the written requirements, which should be slightly above the minimum standard from a DOT perspective, but then you're aspiring to hit a higher, a higher degree when it comes to the quality of candidates you're bringing on, how you coach and train, the level of engagement that you give, the visibility you have from a data perspective. Like, all of that needs to be above and beyond that documented side of things, because then in the court, you're saying, look, industry standard is here.
Yeah.
Our company standard is here, but yet we're performing here, right? Like, that level gives you the sense that, like, you're going above and beyond, which now they can't claim negligence.
That's a great point, and it's probably the most common red line change I make when I'm reviewing a carrier safety policy. They always start with the pie in the sky mission statement that talks about us. We are committed to 100% compliance with the safety regulations. I always say, let's reword this and make it aspirational in nature. We strive for 100% compliance and more, and by doing that, because what you're setting yourself up for is for that policy to be introduced in a case that's brought against you and say, hey, your policy says that you're 100% compliant, but you weren't 100% compliant here. What's your explanation? So if we can go in and say that is always our goal, is to not only be compliant, but be something beyond that. Sometimes we're not going to hit that because we're human. We have humans driving for us, and that's okay. But we're not, pardon the expression, making our own noose to hang ourselves with by doing that. So I think that's a great point. One of the other things before we move on to driver onboarding and orientation is it's something that comes up in the qualification realm a lot, and more so now than ever. We see, I work with a lot of motor carriers whose recruiters play a big role in the driver qualification process. And I get a little concerned when they play too big of a role. Sometimes you'll see carriers structured where the recruiters, for some reason, that boggles my mind, have the ultimate say of whether a driver is qualified or not, beyond the safety department. And so obviously that could be a real problem. I'm curious if you both have thoughts on that.
The thought that I have on that is pretty much in line with what you're saying. And especially if the recruiters are commission based, it's get those guys in the seats. And I won't say that corners are cut, but there is an opportunity to make those exceptions that you may not normally make if there was another set of eyes on it.
Yeah.
There should be a check and balance as the driver goes through the process, and that check and balance, it often continues after the driver's hired. I mean, it may look good on paper, but maybe it's just not the right fit for the driver coming in, and that's when this orientation and onboarding process becomes so important, is to see, is it going to fit the culture, or do we have to have a discussion before this guy even gets out there?
Brian, you stole the words right out of my mouth. Checks and balances, right? Like, you have to look at the incentive structure. Why are people doing what they do? They do it because of incentives, and they do it because of the KPIs, the goals, the metrics that they're based off of. So if you're a recruiter and your metrics, your job performance, your monetary structure is based off of bringing drivers in and putting them in seats, you are negatively incentivized to lean one way or the other when you have a judgment call, right?
Yeah.
And when you have those judgment calls and it's monetarily influenced, but it's influencing your personal monetary gain, like, that's probably not the best situation to put people in, right? And it's not their fault. Like, that's not the recruiter's fault.
Yeah.
That's the structure and the way that you're setting it up. You're
Yeah.
setting them up to fail in those. And you're setting them up to make choices that you might not want them to make, right?
Yeah.
So having a safety or a compliance person involved in that as a major check and balance to the process, I would agree is essential. You obviously don't want to slow down the process. You don't want to put too much of a cumbersome or red tape kind of process involved, but you've got to have some structure to where it like, here's exactly what it needs to be. There's no exceptions off this.
Yeah.
And then here's some of the things that there might be a little bit of wiggle room that we can discuss on, and anything above this, great, bring them in, get them in the door. Like, so you've got to have that process kind of laid out, and it can't be a single person who's monetarily incentivized.
Yeah. Or change the incentive structure, right? Or tie the recruiter's compensation somehow to the safety performance of the drivers that they put in the seat. I mean, because that's the root of the problem, right? It's the disincentive or the negative incentive to put somebody in the truck at all costs.
Yeah.
Guys, we had a question come in here. Let's see. Can you touch on how these topics can be implemented in a cost-effective way for a single truck owner driver with his own authority? Obviously, something we hit on a little bit, but curious for your thoughts on how is it that small trucking companies, even the single-owner operators, can best manage kind of the driver qualification process?
Well, I think that, whether it's someone at home that's putting these together, it's in the regulations, there is that list of, I think it's 7 things that need to be in a DQ file. And once those things are in there, it's just updating yearly medical card, driver's license, MVR. things like that. As far as kind of a cost-effective way to keep yourself safe is, now there is technology in the trucks now, no matter what platform you're using on whether it's a ELD or if you've got running a camera or something like that. And there's reporting abilities. You keep those reports for yourself and show your own performance, and a history of good performance, and that will keep you protected if it ever comes into question. You say, look, I've got these reports for the last year. I had 2% overspeed, no hard brakes, or whatever it is. Here's no severe happenings on the, I can't think of the word, no severe happenings on the camera. All of that technology you can use to your benefit.
Yeah. No, Brian's exactly right. I mean, there are definitely technology packages that you can use. Obviously, as a single truck owner, you don't have to worry about managing a ton of other people's information and keeping a lot of data straight. You're keeping yourself up to date, but really you're trying to find something that gives you the reminders so you can focus on your business and then let some automation take care of the compliance aspect, right? Even if it's as simple as like using Google Calendar and just putting in, when things are expiring, when documentation is due, and just having that reminder. I mean, obviously, there are systems that do this. There's systems that allow you to, input that information, and it gives you reminders and updates, and ties into some of your ELDs and your cameras, as Brian was talking about, to have that digital record of how safe and good of a driver you are, because it's you never need it until you do. And then when you do, it's really important. So, I think there are cost-effective ways to going about it, even if it's kind of lo-fi, jumping in and using a kind of off the shelf normal, like non-trucking specific tool, like a Google Calendar, for example, to make sure that you can jump in and have those reminders of what needs to come due.
Yeah. And let's not forget those real quick on the data that's in that ELD, or the data that you're using in your camera, if you're running one, that's really cost effective because it's included in the cost of what you're already doing.
Right.
So there's no additional cost to run those reports and have access to that information.
Yeah, that's right. I think my biggest piece of advice to smaller motor carriers and owner operators is, first and foremost, you need to know what the rules are. So you as a small trucking company are wearing the hats that maybe 10 or 15 people would be wearing at a larger trucking company. You're trying to manage compliance, you're trying to manage operations, trying to manage billing. And so on the regulatory side of things, I would say seek out information on how best to manage these programs. The best source of information probably happens to be free. If you just Google FMCSA Motor Carrier Safety Planner,
Yes.
The FMCSA has a really good resource called the Motor Carrier Safety Planner that's free on their website that provides a pretty intuitive, bookmarked, outlined version of the safety regulations, and kind of walks you through all the different sections, whether it's driver qualification, hours of service, vehicle maintenance, drug and alcohol testing. So go search that out, read up on that, and that'll give you a feel for what has to be in a DQ file. There's a whole section, and you'll see in that safety planner, it has downloads of documents where, if the regs say you got to have, what's a good example? A previous employer request. It'll link to a form that you can use for that purpose. So that's a free resource. Go check it out on Google. And then shameless plug here. We at Trucksafe, this is exactly who we built our comprehensive regulatory courses for. We're small trucking companies who don't have the resources of the bigger trucking companies to understand their compliance and regulatory obligations. So we've got a bunch of courses. We've got a bunch of documents available. Check them out at trucksafeconsulting.com. All right, guys. I want to move on to talk about...
Real quick, Brandon. Yeah. I that safety planner is about the greatest thing out there. And I equate it to the For Dummies series of books, all those different ones. That is the FMCSA regs for dummies, and that's why I like it so much. I mean,
And it's hidden away. It's hard to find.
The darn thing.
Yeah, I don't know why they make it so hard to find.
Yeah, unless you specifically go after it, not many people know it's there. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know it was there until just pretty recently, quite honestly. Yeah, because it was just hidden.
Yeah, go check that out. So moving on then to driver onboarding and orientation. So we've hit on the topic of qualification. What do we have to do at a minimum before we put butts in a seat? So now let's move on to what happens after we've got a driver qualified and we're looking at kind of a longer term thing in terms of onboarding and orientation. So what other things at this point, once you've got the driver qualified, are we looking at? What other things should be included in a motor carrier's onboarding and orientation programs? Hayden, you want to start out with that one?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we all have a good understanding of orientation. I think everyone does it. Everyone does it generally pretty well. I mean, the more you get executive leadership into those orientation classes, the more buy-in you get, the more you can talk aspirational and high level from a why that driver should be working for your fleet, what's going to be different, why, getting them excited and diving in. But I think one of the things that people don't often do well is the breakout of orientation and onboarding. And I think a lot of this comes down to like vast majority of driver turnover happens in the first 90 days. I mean, that's just like across the industry, that's just a fact. And a lot of that comes down to because these drivers get, they go through a couple day orientation, you give them the keys, you slap them on the butt and say, all right, go make us some money, right? Like that's generally that's obviously a little exaggerated, but I mean, like that's what we hear more often than not from a lot of the fleets that we talk to. And so how do you start to really build that out? And so what we've seen a ton of success with is fleets diving in and doing multi-step, multi-touch point engagements around driver onboarding and being able to template that out and understand, all right, within the first 180 days, right, going in on a 6-month basis, these are all the scheduled touch points that I want to engage with. Day one, I want my driver manager, dispatcher, fleet manager, whatever that frontline operations person title is. I want that person to call that driver and just level set around expectations, right? One of the biggest reasons drivers are leaving is because they got promised something during the recruiting process, and then that information wasn't passed over to the operations teams. Therefore, they couldn't deliver on it, right? So you start to ask questions around why they came to your fleet in the first place. Like what got them excited? What are their expectations around mileage, take-home pay, routes that they're supposed to run, even getting into like personal information around family, pets, sports affiliations. Like you log and document all that information on day one. Then you have a reminder to come back on day 8. And now talking and coaching points for that next interaction are follow-ups from before, right? Hey, did we meet your expectations for mileage? Did you get your home time? You found out the driver's wife was named Jessica. Like, hey, how's Jessica enjoying your transition to ABC Trucking? Like those details matter. And when you can really dial in and have a consistent way and scheduled out, like you give your managers a good template to run off of and give them the reminders in a way to kind of go through this. You do that for the first 6 months, obviously front load it like with good consistent messaging and touch points in the first couple weeks, then the first couple months, then it kind of lightens up over that time period. But you do that, you will build a strong rapport with your drivers. You will give them the sense and understanding that this is a fleet that they want to be at. This is a fleet that they're going to get watched after and not watched over. And I think that is a very important distinction that these drivers need to feel. And if you're not diving into those details and executing off of their expectations, if you don't understand what their expectations are, have those documented, like you're going to be in a world of hurt and you're going to have a leaky bucket like we're seeing in the industry right now.
Yeah, I mean, it seems so obvious because it seems like this is the standard in every other industry, right? This is how we do professions. We make relationships with our workers and we give them a place where they want to be. What other profession do you spend 2 days with a new employee and just say good luck and we'll talk to you when we have something important to say? It's like just spend some time getting to know your folks and making sure that you're getting them what they need to make a successful career.
Well, and I'm going to take a step backwards just a little bit from the onboarding and go back to the orientation piece. And, we touched on it a little bit earlier about getting some of the compliance things out of the way if you can. Now, I work with a lot of smaller accounts, 20s to 50s and things like that. And so their orientation program may not even be a couple to 3 days long, but to have a program that is structured and what's going to happen at what time. And if you can get some of that stuff done early, some of the compliance type things, you want to make your orientation program actionable. And you look at the things that you're presenting to new drivers. Okay, is this actionable? Is this something that they're really going to use? What's wrong with actually putting a written schedule in front of them on day one and say, okay, this is when we're going to touch this, because coming from the driver's side and being through some orientation, some good, some not so good, it's very easy to get them derailed, kind of like a safety meeting. We all know that those can get derailed pretty easily. But, an orientation program can go the same way. So it's got to be a structured deal with actionable items and, make sure they do have that feeling of belong. And just like Hayden said, the person that's running that, they're gathering information as the day goes along. And some of the best ways to do that is on breaks.
Yeah.
Let those guys have their breaks, but you go out, you with them. That's where you can go down the rabbit holes and tell stories and things like that. But you're gathering a lot of information that's going to come very, very handy in that onboarding section that Hayden was talking about, over this next year. And it's just going to continue to build the knowledge that you have of them and the knowledge they have of you. And the one other thing that I'll add to that is transparency. Be transparent with your drivers. Tell them what your business is. Tell them what you do. You don't have to give them how much you're making on every load and stuff like that, but tell them we do good because of this. This freight is our bread and butter, and we take care of these folks, and give them some insight. Maybe even more, it's going to be more powerful coming from a president of the company or some senior VP of operations or whatever title that is, maybe even more so than a recruiter.
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys, who should be involved in this process, in the orientation and onboarding process, in your view?
Man, as many people as you can introduce them to. The orientation person, especially at the size of accounts that I'm talking about, that 50 or 75 and under, a lot of time it's the safety directors also running the recruiting, the safety directors running the orientation. But you want to have that. You want to have the president of the company come in, give a welcome message. That is that initial person. Hey, I'm the number one guy, and here's how great we are, and how great you're going to do with us. You want to start it there. A lot of times there's questions about equipment. Nothing wrong bringing the person that's in charge of maintenance in and kind of going through. Okay, these are the breakdown procedures. Here's your contact information. And once again, let's remember, they're not going to remember everything. So it's so important to cover that stuff again. But as many people as you can get in front of a new driver. And let's also remember too, let's be professional.
Yeah.
Let's dress professional on orientation days. Typically it's, if you've got company shirts or whatever, let's make sure those are worn. I've come in basketball shorts and, a stained t-shirt. That's probably not the best impression that you're going to give. Even if the driver's there wearing that, you don't want to be wearing that. You want to have that professional image. And because I think from the very get-go, drivers want structure. I really believe that they want some sort of structure to work by. And when they find that and it means something to them, you're going to have a better chance of getting through those 90 days or those 6 months, whatever that magic number is, to keep them longer term than that 90-day burnout.
Yeah.
Hayden, any thoughts on who else should be involved?
No, I mean Brian was spot on. From an orientation standpoint, get your executive team. They've got to be there. Like especially if you're batching your orientation, like if you have groups coming in every couple weeks, like get your executive team there. That's going to give you that has to be present. That's going to give you the best sell. When it comes and I think he touched on it, like your safety, your operations, group leaders, your maintenance. Even getting some of the recruiting people who can help with the smooth handoff between who they were dealing with and now who they're going to be dealing with. Driver managers getting there and meeting them in person, the people that they're going to be working closely with. I think the really important part, though, to me is during the onboarding side of things, who do you want to start to get involved? And the answer is as many people as you can get, as often as you can get them, right? Like I think it's clear that you want your driver managers having good engagement with them, terminal managers, like that makes sense. But man, imagine having on 2 weeks in having your payroll person call the driver and specifically ask them, did your paycheck come through, does everything look right, does your mileage right, and then that person saying, thank you for being here, we appreciate everything that you do for us, we're excited to keep you around. Like those messages from people who they would normally never hear from unless there's an issue.
Yeah.
Now congratulating them to come to your fleet and checking on you to make sure that you're getting your pay, having the HR director call in and make sure that like just wanted to check in. Whether it's your husband or wife at home or family members at home, hey, do they understand the benefits package? Do they understand 401k? Do they like being proactive in what your role is? If you can do that to a driver before they have to ask, my goodness, like it makes a world of difference.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because I can imagine when a driver decides that I'm gonna leave a company, it's probably not for one big reason. It's probably death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's, hey, this issue, my pay wasn't working out well and nobody contacted me to figure it out, stuff like that. So those touch points, I think, are critical. I'm curious, we talked a lot about on the qualification side, ways to automate that and different technology that's used to help with those processes. How is technology factoring into the onboarding process? How is technology used in that process? How are carriers doing it in your experience?
I'm gonna go really, really old school on the onboarding piece. That first 6 months, answer your phone. It's as simple as that. Answer your phone. A lot of times there's so much frustration. Yes, there's something going wrong, whether it's with the trucker, with pay, or with dispatch, or whatever the driver's issues are, but they get exacerbated by somebody not answering the phone. And I will be very honest with you, one of the key things that I was taught as a safety manager was you pick up the phone, and what that does is it starts building that you're an advocate for them. And what that does is it makes it a lot easier to bring the hammer down if you have to on somebody that did something wrong, if you've been there for them to help them get something right. So that is probably one of the biggest things. I'll let Hayden talk about the technology piece of it, but from the human side, answering the phone goes a long way with a driver, because there are so many people out there that just won't. And that's part of the reason for retention issues.
Yeah. Well, look, technology should be there to help enable and foster better human connections. That's what technology should be there for, right? Take things that you can automate off your plate so you can have more meaningful conversations with drivers. Like that is what technology should be there for. And so so obviously technology is playing a huge part in this onboarding process, right? You look at some of the LMS platforms that help with driver orientation, some of the driver training, even being able to take some of those training classes before they even get to orientation. Like that's super, super important. Really great providers out there, your Lumas, your Vertical Alliances of the world. They're fantastic. We partner with them. Great people, great organizations. But then when it comes to the actual facilitation of onboarding itself, I think this is a part that you absolutely should look for a solutions provider to help you with. This is something that we've spent a ton of time and energy and resource doing. This is what we help our customers with, and we've seen great success in doing it. And everything that we just talked about, right? Having a consistent process, saying, all right, on day 1, 8, 15, 27, 36, all the way out to day 180 or 360, you can have engagements and touch points lined up. You can have the talking points, the coaching points, all the different things that you want to ask or engage this driver on. List it out so your driver managers aren't reinventing the wheel. You can have it assigned to the right person at the right time, give them tasks and reminders, help them see and understand what's been done in the past so they don't have to go looking for it. Everything's documented and tracked. So it's now all the trainings and coachings are now verifiable from a process standpoint, from a litigation standpoint. Like, technology enables you and your teams to care at the level you want them to care at, right? Because as a driver manager, you're coaching 30, 40, 50 drivers, right? You're supposed to keep them on time, on track, safe, coming home. You've got so many plates that you're spinning, so many fires you're trying to put out. There's no way that you can remember that this new driver loves the Dallas Cowboys and has a Dak Prescott jersey and his dog's name's Spike. Like, you're never going to remember those things. So having a system that allows you to and prompts you to follow up on those types of insights allows you to have more driver engagements, have more effective driver engagements, and make sure that those drivers know that you care.
Yeah.
And so that technology has to be there to enable those real and meaningful engagements and moments with your drivers. And if you do that, then you will see turnover improve. Like, I guarantee it.
Yeah. Guys, I think we're about out of time here, so I want to leave everybody with just kind of your big takeaway that you could offer on, if you had one piece of advice to fleets when it comes to their onboarding, orientation, qualification programs, what would it be? Hayden, you want to go first?
Sure. Qualification, meet the minimum standards, exceed it by a little bit, and have it documented. But the big takeaway for me is orientation and onboarding are two distinct things. Orientation, couple days to a week. Onboarding should be 6 months to a year at minimum. Have it, own it, make sure your drivers feel the love from you and your fleets. If you do that, though, you will see a dramatic reduction in the turnover of your drivers. And that improves not only the bottom line, it improves safety, it improves your fleet's reliability and your brand out in the marketplace.
Great. Brian?
I'm going to start with the qualification side as well. Automate as much as you can of it. Get that piece out of the way so you can make your orientation time actionable. Make a good first impression. And during that onboarding time, you make sure that the lines of communication stay open and answer your phone and make sure that those conversations, as much as possible, stay in a positive light. Even when you're working through some tough stuff, you want to be able to get through that 6 month time frame. So you got to have a positive communication level.
Yeah. Hey, Brian, Hayden, thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate all of your insight. Hey, tell everybody where they can find out more information about Idelic and then Reliance Partners.
Yeah, idelic.com, idelic.com, or you can reach out to me personally at hayden@idelic.com.
Reliance Partners is reliancepartners.com. I can be reached at brian.runnels@reliancepartners.com. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Awesome. You guys are great. Take them up on their offer. Anybody watching this, I know just being able to reach out to Hayden, being able to reach out to Brian, bounce things off of them. They've been such great sounding boards for me, and they're willing to do it. So take them up on that offer. All right, guys, we're going to wrap this show up. Appreciate everybody joining us today. Again, thanks to Brian and Hayden for all of their great insight on these important topics. If you want more information on driver qualification or anything in that regard, make sure you check out our website, trucksafeconsulting.com. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a bunch of basic driver qualification forms that carriers can use to meet their qualification requirements under the regulations. We've also got our own training platform, Trucksafe Academy. It's trucksafeacademy.com. We've got courses that are built specifically towards safety managers and those in a position of managing drivers who need kind of a high-level overview of the safety regulations in an easy-to-understand, intuitive format. So we've got online courses available at trucksafeacademy.com. So check those out. Hey, be sure to tune in next month for our next Trucksafe Live show. Not quite sure what the topic's going to be yet. We'll get that nailed down here in the next week or so. If you have any show ideas or any guest ideas, feel free to reach out to us. Our website's trucksafelive.com. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you soon.